The following podcast is taken from a live broadcast on Inspire FM.
Assalamu alaikum listeners, my name is Shakil Shah of Wolf & Co Solicitors. This is another segment of Ask Your Lawyer show today at Inspire FM Luton. We will be discussing today modern slavery and also human trafficking and the acts and offences around modern slavery, human trafficking and county lines. I have today with me one of the barristers from London. His name is Liam Loughlin. Can you introduce yourself, Liam?
Hi, my name is Liam Loughlin. I'm a barrister from Church Court Chambers, dealing with various criminal matters as a criminal defence lawyer.
Okay. Yeah, so we also be having another barrister on the show, but he unfortunately he's not able to attend in person, but he will be calling in. So today we'll be discussing modern slavery. So Liam, as to start off with you, what is modern slavery?
Well, modern slavery is a broad gamut of behaviours that have been brought into the criminal law by the Modern Slavery Act 2015. And that is to put into effect the European Council's protocols and directives on modern slavery and human trafficking.
Okay, so what is it comprised of? What's the elements of modern slavery?
Well, the main section that we're concerned with is Section 2 of the Modern Slavery Act 2015.
Yep.
And that states that a person commits an offence if they arrange or facilitate the travel of another person to exploit them. And it's irrelevant whether that person is an adult or a child, or whether they consent to travel. And then we're also concerned with Section 4 of the same Act, putting into law Article 3 of the Palermo Protocol.
Okay. So in terms of exploitation, what kind of exploitation do they mean when they say for the travel of a person for exploitation? What kind of exploitation is it?
Well, we're seeing a broad gamut of exploitation, not only trafficking from outside of this jurisdiction, but trafficking within this jurisdiction and also modern slavery. So there have been a number of cases before the courts. They have involved allegations within the British and Irish traveller community. There are other groups in relation to Vietnamese people who have been found to be the victims of modern slavery and trafficking, working in cannabis factories and also working in nail bars. We're seeing a growing problem and a greater number of referrals through the national referral mechanism from women from Albania who say that they've been the victims of sexual trafficking. So they've been brought into this country, often under the promise of work, legitimate work, and then have been forced into a life of prostitution. So it covers a broad gamut of various forms of exploitation.
Okay, we got Tomas McGarvey online, one of our barristers and our friend. Hi, Thomas.
Hi, good afternoon, or good evening, Shakil. Hi, Liam.
Hi, how you doing?
Very good, thanks. Listening with interest.
Yeah, so today we are discussing a topic of modern slavery. So I know Liam already explained what modern slavery is and what is exploitation and stuff. What's your take on that?
I agree wholeheartedly with Liam when he suggests that it's not just limited to the Irish traveller community. I think the people of Luton in particular would probably associate the modern Slavery Act with the Irish traveller community, because there was quite a significant case in the Luton area, and I think in fact your firm, Shakil Liberty Law, were heavily involved in that case, as were other local Luton firms, and I think you guys actually had some good results. But the reason that they would associate with Irish travellers in the Luton area is because that was what that case was all about. It was people that were forced into labour by travellers in the areas that travellers had basically set up their work streams, and it goes much further than that. Liam has given some examples that of course are right. There's another example from a case that I've done whereby people will be familiar with fruit and vegetable pickers in the Norfolk area in particular. and Suffolk, and we've seen a number of different slavery cases arising in those areas where people have been trafficked in from Eastern European countries, often on the promise of all sorts of wonderful things such as housing, improved conditions for their lives, better access to education and to medical services, and actually found themselves paying off falsified debts and victims of slavery. So it crosses all boundaries.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for your explanation on this. And now we obviously there are people who are victims of modern slavery, and some people are not victims and they are accused of modern slavery. So what is the what separates a victim and a person who is accused of the offence? So what's the difference between a person who is actually committing an offence and who is actually a victim to this offence? Liam, if you...
Well, there's a distinction to be made between somebody who is accused of participating in this kind of conduct and somebody who's actually been proven to the criminal standard to be involved. So there will be situations where people may be unhappy of their working conditions, or they may have entered into some sort of arrangement to facilitate their entry into the United Kingdom. They may well have entered into an agreement from some parts of the European Union, such as Poland or Romania, for board and for food and for accommodation. And there is an open question sometimes as to whether is that exploitation, is that trafficking, isn't that modern slavery, or is that just somebody merely exchanging their labour in return for normal levels of remuneration? And sometimes when people want to stay in this country, and perhaps they don't have a legitimate reason, they may allege that they're the victim of trafficking, because as you will know, Shakil, if you qualify as a victim of trafficking, that automatically massively assists your right to stay in this country.
Yeah, I understand that because I deal with immigration as well, and I know victims of human trafficking do get discretionary leave, and so in some cases they get indefinite leave to remain in the UK because they are victims and they need to be protected by the UK government regardless of where they come from. They get to stay in the UK if they are proven that they were victims of domestic violence. Victim of modern slavery. We are live listeners on 01582481822. That's 01582481822. If you do have any questions, please call in. Our barristers will be happy to assist you. If you have any question on modern slavery or modern slavery, human trafficking, or any other areas of law, we will be happy to help. You can also WhatsApp us on 07779481822. That's 07779481822. We are live on Facebook. You can also comment or message in on Facebook, and we'll be able to pick up your queries and we put to our guests on the panel. So modern slavery, can it also be domestic, like in the families? Can it be is there a type of modern slavery as well?
But there is a type of modern slavery. There's various different types. One is domestic servitude. So there was a fairly recent case of a man who was convicted at Woolwich Crown Court. He was living in Charlton. He had entered into an arranged marriage, originally with a lady from Pakistan. That relationship had not progressed how he had wanted it to, and especially not how she had wanted it to, with the net result that essentially she was forced to stay in the home. She didn't have any outside contact. She was forced to care for the husband's mother and various other people. And she was, in effect, a victim of modern slavery herself, because she was in domestic servitude. So it can happen in the home as readily as it can happen on the farm or on the building site. Okay.
Thomas, are you still there?
Yes.
In terms of families, can a forced marriage be a type of modern slavery if someone is forced into marriage?
I think the act of forced into marriage, I mean, that's a difficult thing to define because, of course, what do we mean by forced? But the act of getting married in an arranged marriage, let's say, to take away the word of forced, that in itself could provide the circumstances in which a modern slavery offence could take place. It in itself, I would suggest, perhaps isn't, for many reasons, including cultural reasons. But I do think that when you find a situation where a family member who would be a wife or a husband in the home has married into a situation and then found themselves having to be essentially on call 24 hours a day, usually expected to work around that property, being forced to work around that property, then of course we find ourselves in a domestic servitude situation. But the reality is a victim can be a spouse, husband or wife, partner, child, any family member. They can be male or female, young or old, a UK national or foreign national. It pretty much covers everybody. Anybody could find themselves as a victim in a servitude or slavery situation. And in fact, perhaps this is something that we could have dealt with at the end, but perhaps I'll deal with it now. Another thing that listeners need to be very careful about is when, for example, you find yourself going to get your car washed, or you find yourself on a country road at a farm shop or at a stall on the side of the road buying vegetables or something of that nature, always be aware of the person that you're engaging with, because often we see examples of areas where we could actually see somebody who is a victim having to work. We often see people working at markets that perhaps find themselves in less than desirable conditions. But I think the point that Liam made earlier in the show was a very good one. The area between somebody who is a victim and somebody who has willingly taken the decision to come to the UK and work for an agreed package, it is a difficult area to try and decide who is actually a victim in all of this, because often people make choices that others wouldn't make for a variety of reasons, and so certain people may look upon that person as a victim, but others may look upon them as somebody who's made an economic decision. It may not be the best economic decision, but an economic decision nonetheless. So it's a relatively recent area in regards to criminal offences. It's an act that started to take effect in around 2015. So it's relatively early days for this legislation, but it seems to be relatively clear-cut at this stage how it's being applied. Certainly when we look at the recent examples that both myself and Liam have dealt with, and perhaps it's now been linked a little more, as you mentioned at the start of the show, to county lines cases and cases where we've got drug trafficking across the UK, and where we've got the use of people who find themselves victims of slavery or servitude. And again, if we look at the people that are raising that defence, the defence under the Modern Slavery Act, it's not being raised by any one category of people. It's been raised by a wide variety of people, from, again, those who came in from another country, those who have been in this country for a significant period of time, or indeed young men and women, young boys and girls who found themselves dragged into the murky world of drugs and are being used essentially as runners to cross county lines. That giving the whole operation its name, County Lines case, has come from the idea of crossing county lines. And so we now see the Modern Slavery Act biting in that particular area. We often see it biting in many different legal areas. Okay,
thank you very much. So he's like we mentioned, county lines cases. So Liam, what do you think of county lines and how does that work?
Well, I think county lines is all part of this general idea of a changing understanding of how we view criminal liability, especially amongst young people. And we've found ourselves seesawing in relation to this aspect ever since the Jamie Bolger killing of when is a young person responsible, when does a young person have the ability to consent. And it's something we're battling and debating across all forms of the law in relation to gender change, in relation to the age of consent for sexual relations, in relation to when people leave home or fight in the army. And county lines is another case of that consideration, because there was a long time when young people who were involved in selling drugs outside of London, or indeed for gangs within London, were viewed themselves as criminals and they were being criminalised. But now the law is looking towards assessing that properly under the Modern Slavery Act, Section 45, to look at whether those young people are actually capable of exercising free choice and whether they've been exploited themselves. Because it's not just a matter of moving individuals across borders within continents or across continents within the globe. It's also a question of moving individuals from a space where they are safe and where they're not exploited to a different place where they are being exploited. And county lining is another example of that. So perhaps if just to explain that in a bit more detail, because it may be a term that your listeners are familiar with, but it is perhaps rarely unpacked in the media. County lining essentially refers to the movement of young people, normally by elders within criminal gangs, the older people, if you like, at the top of this hierarchy, who move young people from one area to another, normally outside of London, in order predominantly to sell drugs. And so what these gangs have done, the London gangs and the Birmingham gangs and the more organised criminal groups, have found that there are markets available. And like any business led by ruthless business people, they are moving young people to these areas to sell drugs, quite often cuckolding them, which is putting them into addresses where there may be an addict who's vulnerable, and then using that address to sell drugs. And then when that place is inevitably raided by the police, as it so often is, that young person, and indeed a person whose property has been given up, they are to be sacrificed. And they'll fill up another property with another person who's been county lined, who's young and vulnerable, the following week.
Yeah. Okay, that explains it very well. Now, county lining, I know we were recently dealing with a couple of cases where these gangs were involved and some children were exploited to use as just to sell drugs in county lines. And usually I've come across where people were sending children on different trains every day, just on the routes, you have to go to this village on this train line, you are taking that train line. So it's like a network. I know there are certain indicators of how someone could be potentially a victim to exploitation in terms of county lines. So if a normal person sees such a child alone, what is the indicator that he might be exploited or he might be a victim of a county line drugs gang?
Well, I think the first thing and the first place that this needs to start is in the home. And it's very easy as lawyers to sit here and to criticise and to be critical of parents quite often struggling in very, very difficult circumstances, perhaps single parents who have multiple children or parents who are working and just find it hard to keep an eye on their children, or perhaps who live in very difficult areas. But county lining involves moving a young person, normally from where they are, to a place where they're not normally. Yeah. So that's normally outside of London. So the parents have to be alive to that. If their 13, 14-year-old child is disappearing for a day at a time, or days at a time, is not in school, then that's the first sign that there's problems. And it has to start with the parents keeping an eye out. And then, of course, it moves to the neighbourhoods. If you're living in a small village or a small town and suddenly a young person appears who's never been seen around there before, doesn't look like perhaps they're involved in the area, calling the police is not necessarily reporting that person to the police for a criminal offence. Sometimes it is actually rescuing them from a situation where they themselves have been trafficked. And that comes on to something that we'll talk about probably a little later on, which is the national referral mechanism for young people who have been trafficked within this country.
Okay. Thomas, question for you as well. I was just reading a survey that in London alone there are 4,000 children who are used in county lines. What is your say on that?
Shakil, that doesn't surprise me. It's a shocking statistic. It really is, and it's very worrying because I'm pretty sure it's a statistic that's growing, not reducing. My experience in county lines cases perhaps is indicative of the problem that we've got. There have always been drug conspiracies as long as there have been drugs. That is a given, and that has changed over the years. The way in which drug supply has operated has changed, usually because the criminals think they're one step ahead of the police, and the police catch up with a particular way of dealing drugs, and the criminals decide to then deal drugs in a different way to try and avoid detection, and so on and so forth we carry on. With county lines, it seems that those who are at the top end of any particular criminal conspiracy have realised that by using people of a certain age or younger, they get two particular benefits. The first benefit is younger people tend to be easily rewarded. So, for example, if you give a person of a certain age, let's say 14 or 15 years of age, £100, that's a significant amount of money. Those people don't necessarily need to spend money on mortgages. They don't have to keep a car on the road. They certainly don't have children to feed. And so it's a very large amount of money, and it means they can go and spend that money on the things that 15-year-olds want to spend their money on. Nice phones, nice shoes, nice sports gear and all the rest of it. And so that's an easy fix for those children. And so it's an easy exploitation for those who want to make the exploitation. The second issue is if those children get caught, the criminals have realized that actually the courts will deal with them slightly differently. They won't necessarily prosecute them. They do prosecute them in certain circumstances because, of course, just because the Modern Slavery Act provides a defence and provides a classification of victim for a large number of people, it doesn't apply to everybody. So, of course, they look to these people as being people that may not be prosecuted. And so there's a real benefit there for using younger people. And that seems to be what most criminal organisations are doing at the moment. They are using very young children, certainly to courier the drugs from area A to area B, and then, as Liam quite rightly said, cuckolding them into a property in a particular area. One of the things that the parents in particular, who may, for example, realise that their child has all of a sudden turned up with a new pair of trainers or a new phone that they didn't buy them, and they can't quite work out where that money's come from, but they see their child going to school every day and coming back. And certainly there have been cases that I've been involved in where children have actually been couriering drugs from one destination to another in their school uniform. So there are children playing truant and actually not going to school. And from their parents' perspective, they are going to school because they head off in the morning, they come back in the evening, and they're in their school uniform. So it's worth just keeping an eye on things like that, and maybe just making sure that attendance is what it should be at school, because it's not a case of it won't happen to my child. It can happen to any child, because the motivation is a financial motivation in some circumstances. There are other circumstances, as Liam has quite rightly identified, where vulnerable children, vulnerable because of all manner of circumstances, are picked upon. Those who are in and out of care and find themselves in desperate situations, they of course are victimised. But these people don't care which children they use, and that's the reality of it. So if they can convince your child to do it, then they will, and that's what we all need to be quite cautious about.
Okay, thank you very much. So the Act who deals with these sort of offences, Modern Slavery Act. So what offences Modern Slavery Act deal with, Liam?
Well, perhaps if we deal with the defence first of all, whilst we're on county lining, because for anybody who's a victim of trafficking, there is a defence at law under Section 45, and the test is slightly different for an adult to that for a child. So if you're accused of any offence, bar serious offences such as murder or causing grievous bodily harm with intent, or manslaughter, which is the unlawful killing of another, you are entitled under the Modern Slavery Act to a defence, which is a new development, because there were frequently times prior to 2015 where you may have an individual who's been trafficked into the country, they're being exploited. They may, for example, be working in an office, cleaning up or assisting there, and suddenly they're found with identity documents, and they're charged with an offence under the law for that. But the reality is they've been trafficked into the country, they've been exploited, and so they should have a defence. So if that person is an adult and they've been found to have committed an offence, if they can show that they were compelled to do so, and that was as a result of slavery or relevant exploitation, and if a jury is of a view that a reasonable person with relevant characteristics in the same position as that person would have no realistic alternative to committing the offence, then they have a defence. And again, it's this reasonable person. Of course, this reasonable person perhaps never existed, but we look towards the characteristics of that individual and we say, would a reasonable person have acted as aided in that situation? And then the reason why we come on to children is because there's a slightly lower threshold for children under Section 45(4) of the Modern Slavery Act. They only have to commit an offence as a direct consequence of their being a victim of slavery. And then the question then is, would a reasonable person in the same position and having that person's characteristics, including their age, which is important in this circumstance, would they have committed the offence involved? So it's a slightly lower threshold, because obviously once you get over the age of 18, it doesn't really matter perhaps if you're 20 or 50. But obviously when you look at what a reasonable person would have done, if that person is 12, 13, 14, what's reasonable for that person then changes. So it's a slightly lower threshold. So that's the defences. And we can move on to the actual offences. So we've touched upon Section 2. We also have Section 4, which is effectively dealing with the same issue. It's all to do with exploitation, and it needs to be understood broadly before we deal on with the specifics of what we're talking about when we're talking about human trafficking, when we're talking about modern slavery. And it's to do with the exploitation and the violation of somebody else's will, freedom and integrity.
Sorry, I'll have to stop you. We have a break coming up, and we will deal with the act itself after the break. So thank you for listening, listeners, and you please call in on 01582481822 if you have any questions or any queries. Please take part in the show. We are still waiting on the listeners to call in, but we haven't received any calls yet. So please call in on 01582481822 or WhatsApp in on 07779481822. We'll see you on the other side of the break. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum, this is Atif Nawaz. Listen to Inspire FM shows in your time by heading over to inspirefm.org or listen on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.
Welcome back, listeners. It's the show Ask Your Lawyer show. My name is Shakil Shah of Wolf and Co. Solicitors. We also have our panelists today, two barristers from Church Court Chambers, Liam, Loughlin and Tomas McGarvey. Thomas, are you still there?
Still here, Shakil, thank you.
Okay, no problem. Okay, so you were just discussing modern slavery and county lines. Whilst being on the advert, we were listening to an advert regarding being subject to sexual abuse as a child. So I think that is a relevant advert to our show. So we just wanted to shed some light on how can sexual abuse be part of this topic. So Thomas, if you take on this, the advert you just said.
Absolutely, Skill, and funny, I thought exactly the same thing myself when I heard the advert. I think the way to address the question is this. Before there can be any victims within this context of offending, we need to look at the background of any of those victims, and obviously those who are vulnerable are going to be the most obvious choice of children or young people to be targeted by people who want to involve them in offending and want to victimise them. And so where would you look if you're one of these people? You would obviously look around those who are indeed victims of all sorts of abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse. You look at children who aren't necessarily engaging at school. You look at children that aren't necessarily engaging at home and perhaps are in and out of care and things of that nature. And sadly, what you'll also find is you'll find that once these people who want to use children in this way find a child that works for them, then they can often use that child to recruit other children. And that's one of the sad things about this. And particularly when we look at sexual abuse and what happens to those who are victims of sexual abuse. If a child is a victim of sexual abuse at home, the procedures that we have in this country mean that once it's reported, social services will more often than not get involved and remove the child from the home if they are of a certain age, under a certain age. Once that child is removed from the home, if there's not a family member that can look after that child, or if one of the parents are unable to look after that child, then the child can often find themselves in a care situation. And that's unfortunately one of the positions that we often see. We see people that are taken away from their home environment for good reason. They find themselves in and out of the care system. They're vulnerable children, and they are more susceptible perhaps to being easily convinced into getting involved into something that perhaps they wouldn't want to get involved in, or they shouldn't get involved in if they were in a more comfortable and less vulnerable position at home. So I certainly think that's one of the breeding grounds for where we will find these victims coming from. But it's not the only one, Shakil. I emphasise that. It certainly isn't the only one. And as I said earlier, all children are potential victims and could find themselves involved in this sort of offending.
Yeah. Okay, Liam, can sexual abuse also be linked to modern slavery?
Yes, so I think we've got to be aware that we're not only talking about trafficking of adult females into this jurisdiction to be exploited, but the investigations that we've seen at the moment are some of the widespread investigations that have taking place that touch upon all elements of the community and touch upon the care system in this country have also involved the trafficking of young people. In the same way a young person can be exploited into selling drugs when they're underage, they can also be exploited into effect being sexually abused by these people, being used as toys, being used as sexual playthings, and that also is trafficking of young people. It's just that as we as a society mature, we thought we had abolished the evils of slavery, but now we understand that actually the exploitation of a young person's will is also an issue of free will, and there's also an issue of sort of modern slavery. And that's what we've seen with these young children, sometimes 13, 14 years old, in a care system, unable perhaps to care for them properly, underfunded to an extent, and these young people being exploited by older people and being forced to have multiple abortions or having sex with hundreds of men. And that also is a type of modern slavery, because that young person's will has been overborne and they are exploited. And this is the real tragedy of it all, is that sometimes these people don't realise until many years later they're being exploited. It may be the young person in care who doesn't feel cared for, who thinks they're getting affection. Well, they're not getting affection, they're actually being exploited. It may be the young person who thinks they're getting money to go and buy some new trainers, but they're not getting money to buy some new trainers. They're actually putting their freedom and putting their life and their livelihood on the line, because if they get a criminal record, even as a young person, that will stay with them for the rest of their lives. And not everybody who is a victim of trafficking will necessarily be found to have been a victim of trafficking.
Okay. Thomas, in terms of, we were talking about the Act itself, the Modern Slavery Act. I know you touched upon it previously. How did the actual Act come about, and what does it cover?
Well, Shakil, the Act came about in 2015, and essentially it brought together a number of different offences that were already essentially available in different formats, and it created a singular Act which tried to cover modern slavery in the UK as best as it could. But as I said, it's a relatively recent Act, and whilst we've seen a huge amount of cases passing through the system, it's still relatively early days for this type of legislation. There's other legislation that has stemmed from this Act, and in fact, there was a case that I was involved in Suffolk, which, as I said, involved those who were picking fruit and vegetables in the fields, and it involved the Gang Masters Licensing Act, which is a linked Act. And again, it all deals with how we use people in different types of employments or in different types of work environments. And whilst we've been talking about offending along the lines of drugs, along the lines of those who are forced within the home to work, it's not limited to that. And in fact, what might surprise some of your listeners is that there's an implication and a requirement on companies in this country now who turn over a certain amount of money, a significant amount of money. It's £36 million a year. But you'd be surprised that actually covers quite a large amount of companies in this country, and they now have a requirement to produce a report essentially to show that they've looked into their business and all of the lines of operation within their business, and they're happy that there are no issues in relation to the Modern Slavery Act arising. So it's certainly been a very positive development. I think before the break, Liam was just going through some of the offences under the Slavery Act, and I think he got to Section 2, if I remember rightly.
Yep.
What the Act does is, as I said, it provides these new offences. One of the interesting things is trying to find a definition for slavery, for example. It's not an easy thing to define. If you ask one of your listeners now to define slavery, they will think of perhaps the movies that they've seen, 7 Years a Slave and things of that nature, and try to identify slavery in that sense. But what the Modern Slavery Act actually does is it creates a whole network of offences that perhaps deal with things that aren't as simple as what we all think of slavery, somebody in shackles being forced to work. It starts to deal with a variety of areas in which perhaps we had never thought about there being the possibility of somebody being enslaved. A good example being, for example, somebody who has a live-in cleaner, somebody who is living in a big house, perhaps the people who own the house are wealthy, and in fact they've probably engaged a company to provide a cleaner or a maid, and they think the person that's working for them is on the right adequate amount of remuneration. They think that their conditions are good, but actually that person is in fact a victim. And so the Act has actually spread the application of this across society within lots of different areas, and it's opened a lot of people's eyes as to where and when people could be finding themselves victim to servitude.
Okay, so it's not limited to criminals only. It also affects businesses and the big companies where the employees are usually labourers and any other sort of employment. So Liam, what's carry on. Sorry, Thomas.
Yeah, I would just say absolutely, and that's one final point on that, Shakil, is you'll see now a lot of companies having to change perhaps their supply chains and change the way in which they source products, because obviously what could be worse for a large company than finding out that actually your brand is associated with slave labour. We've seen it with Apple, for example, and the criticism they've received because they have certain production lines in China where there's been significant criticism about the age of the people involved in working and the conditions in which they work in China. And so similarly, it can happen in this country, and people have to be very careful, particularly people in the food industry. If you have a very fancy, expensive restaurant in London, it won't go very well for your brand if they find out that your fruit and veg is being supplied by a company that actually is allowing modern slavery offences to take place, whether that was deliberate or whether it was neglectful. And what the Act has now done for certain companies is provided a requirement for them to actually check, so these problems don't just linger in the shadows.
Yeah, I was reading a news on Christmas, I believe, where a child bought a Christmas card, and the Christmas card was already used. It was written on, some note was written on it, and the first family didn't think much of it. And then when they read the note actually said that we are doing forced labor. I think it was very famous, some very famous company, and they had to shut their warehouse down in China, where they were actually victims of modern slavery, where they were forced to do the labor, and that's the only way they thought to send a message to the world that we are being abused here. And so they actually wrote inside the Christmas card, which is
I recall seeing that, Shakil, and that's perhaps one of the most recent and the most significant examples of a company having to react when they get information that actually a supply chain that they perhaps haven't done enough due diligence with is one that they don't want to be involved with. I'm sure when that particular national company that you're talking about, that I won't name, found out that they were in problems, then of course they changed their supply chain.
Yeah, that is. It was really sad of even reading it. I think you might have seen it, Liam, as well.
I did. It ruined my Christmas, but it didn't help it.
Yeah, it would actually ruin the Christmas when you're opening the Christmas cards to write to friends and stuff. So they didn't open it until later, and then they found out that the card was already used. So now we were on the Act itself. I was reading a survey online. There are 45 million people are living in modern slavery worldwide. So is this a fair survey? What do you think, Liam?
Well, I mean, it's very difficult to tell. I know that I've seen reports where one estimate is actually about 0.5% of the world's population are in some form of slavery, modern slavery or otherwise. I mean, there were reports coming out of Sudan from the conflict there of modern slavery and actual slave trading taking place. I read another report where 50% of all modern slaves actually live in India. And if anybody sort of travelled around India, as I have, you'll see people where there's sometimes a border between who is actually a servant on very, very low pay and somebody who's being exploited. And it's sort of the same thing in Uganda with Shambho boys, quite often sleeping outside the house in inadequate housing for not money, but just food and a place to stay. So, I mean, I think we do see it all around the world. And this is really the whole point about what we're trying to do in this country, is because it's all very well to look at slavery. And of course, slavery is as old as mankind itself. One only needs to look at the Bible to see that the Hebrews enslaved in Babylon. And of course, it's the history of all the peoples of the book as we look through it and in modern history. But in this country, we're looking towards our supply chains. We're looking towards other countries. And it's no point us sitting in the United Kingdom condemning the Uyghurs and what's happening over there that's being perpetrated allegedly by the Chinese, with these people being forced to stay, being forced by the Chinese state to work as police officers and so on and so forth. When in this country, we set a poor example and we let our young people go out and be exploited. We let our young men go to women who are not freely selling sex as a commodity, but are being exploited and effectively raped every day. And that's really what we're looking at, and that's what we're trying to combat here. And I think that's why this act is drafted so broadly, because it's not just slavery, it's servitude, it's compulsory labour, it's human trafficking, and it's trying to deal with these issues to say, well, is that man working, doing your tarmacking? Is he a man who's not earning very much, who perhaps doesn't deserve to earn very much? Maybe he's been in trouble, he can't get a job. Or is he staying somewhere and subsisting? Not existing, not thriving, but is he being exploited and merely subsisting?
Okay. Yeah, modern slavery, it has an effect on everyone in the daily life. So I will request my listeners, if you tune into call in 01582481822. You can also message in on 07779481822. It's a very hot topic, and everyone needs to be aware of this. That how can someone be involved in modern slavery by knowingly or without even knowing that they are being victims of modern slavery. So Thomas, there are some victims where they're not even aware that they are actually going through modern slavery when they are. So what's your view on that?
That's absolutely right, Shakil. In fact, I was involved in a case in Wales where it was in fact the first prosecution under this act in Wales, and the victim in that case was an unfortunate man who had found himself on hard times, but in fact he wasn't in a position where he had no family and no friends or nobody to assist him or look after him. He was actually in quite a good position with family and friends. They had a place for him to stay. He didn't have to pay for it, and they assisted him. But one of the problems he had is he had a gambling addiction, and so in relation to his addiction, that was something that his family wouldn't allow him to engage with. So albeit that they would feed him, clothe him, give him a place to live, allow him to do many things and provide for him to do many things, and essentially give him a very good life, he wanted to gamble, and he couldn't satisfy that addiction within the family arena. And so what he found was that he left the family environment. He was a man of limited intelligence, so he suffered from a number of different problems in relation to his ability to understand things, but also in respect of his mental health and physical health. He then found himself in a situation where he was living with some Irish travellers. And when I say living with them, he was in a mobile home on their land with very limited access to things such as shower and toilet, but he did have access. And the essential point in all of this was that he was often dropped into the local town so that he could go to the bookie shop, so that he could put on some bets with the bookmakers, so that he could gather a few personal items that he needed, and then make his way back to the farm where he was expected to work 6 or 7 days a week for 12 to 14 hours a day. And so in those circumstances, he certainly didn't know or think he was a victim. He didn't report himself, and initially he often suggested that those who were holding him captive were actually his friends. And so certainly had he not been told and had he not been plucked out of that environment that it's not okay, then perhaps he wouldn't have got the help he needed. And in fact, in that case, it was interesting. It was two people charged. One was acquitted and one was convicted. And the lines are quite blurry as to why one was convicted and one wasn't in those situations. So, yeah, absolutely, some people don't realise they're a victim. There's also another side of the coin, Shakil. If there's anybody listening that thinks, I can use this defence in my upcoming trial, whatever that trial may be. Well, we see a lot of people now trying to run this defence when actually they are not victims of slavery or servitude, but it's a defence that they could perhaps try and rely upon. And I'm sure that Liam has had as many examples as I have of cases where people want to rely on that defence, but actually, for a variety of reasons, it's not a defence that is applicable to them. So whilst there are people that think, there are people out there that don't know that they're a victim, there are also people out there that may be thinking that they're a victim or trying to suggest that they're a victim as a way of avoiding criminal prosecution, when in fact that particular set of circumstances that would allow them to be relying on that defence don't necessarily exist in their case.
Yeah. Okay, Liam, as he mentioned about the defence, where they say they are actually victims themselves. So what do you think of that?
Well, it's a difficult task. It has to be arguable, and you have to be able to raise it as a defence, evidentially. But once you raise it, it's for the prosecution to disprove. So it depends on the circumstance. Of course, if you're a 42-year-old man and you're driving a BMW and you're stopped with 40 wraps of crack cocaine and heroin in your pocket, it's going to be quite difficult to say you've been trafficked and you've been exploited. But actually, if you're a 14-year-old boy, or perhaps you're coming from Hackney and you're sent out to somewhere like Cromer in Norfolk, and you may think that you're a little gangster and that you're living the life, and you may not think that actually you're being exploited at all. But the reality is you may well be, and that's the thing. Sometimes people can believe that they're being exploited and they aren't, but sometimes people don't realise that they're being exploited at all, and they are. But the reality is that it acts in the same way the defence of duress acts in law. You raise it evidentially, so you have to be able to at least assert its existence, and then it has to be disproved. So everything is fact-specific in relation to this particular defence. But obviously, if it's without basis, it's without basis. But certainly for young people, for women who are perhaps, or indeed men who've been exploited and put into the sex trade, it may well be a defence that's open to them.
Okay. Yeah, Thomas, I know it's a relatively new area of law, and there are not a lot of precedents on this, and there's in terms of sentencing and stuff. And what is the general criteria of sentencing in these kind of offences? Do people go to prison for this, or?
Shakil, absolutely, it's certainly an imprisonable offence, and whilst it's a relatively early area of law, as you say, or a recent piece of legislation, there are cases that have been sentenced, and we can look at those sentences to give us guidance. But the reality is, if you find yourself in a situation where you're charged with an offence of holding somebody in servitude or a modern slavery offence, pack your bag and get ready for prison, because, of course, it's not the kind of offences that you may think can be dealt with effectively in the community. If somebody has been willing to engage in this type of behaviour, it's a requirement and an expectation for society, you may think, for these people to go to jail. What we haven't quite got to yet at this stage is sentencing guidelines for Modern Slavery Act offences. We see sentencing guidelines in a variety of offending areas. We see sentencing guidelines for drug offences, for sexual offences, for all sorts of assault offences, for burglary, and sentencing guidelines for the way in which most offences are being sentenced as we move forward, as the government seeks to try and simplify the way in which we approach it. And so we haven't seen it yet. We've seen some guidance prepared, but we rely on previous cases, and we rely on certain requirements when making a decision as to how long a sentence would be.
Okay. So, Liam, so there is no definitive sentencing guidelines at the moment for modern slavery offences?
No, there's no definitive guidelines. It carries a maximum of life imprisonment.
Okay.
The maximum sentence carried by the law. And of course, it depends on the circumstances, how many people were exploited, the level of that exploitation, how long it went on for. So, of course, there may be a short-lived example. It may be somebody who's running a car wash, for example, and people are brought in. They stay for him for a while. He's taking more money than he should. They're not allowed to leave when they should. It could be that kind of exploitation. And then at the other end, there are people who are kept as really virtual slaves for 20 years. And, of course, they attract markedly different sentences. But this is very new. It's only been around for 5 years, and I think the courts are still feeling their way out and around the kind of sentences that can be imposed. And, of course, when they know and there's a better idea, I suspect we'll see sentencing guidelines to reflect what we're seeing in the courts every day.
Yep. Okay, that's very helpful. Now, listeners, we have covered modern slavery and linked offences and the defences, and also the circumstances where an offence can be committed and what defences people may have. If you still have any questions, please call in on 01582 481822. That's 01582 481822. We only got about 6-7 minutes to go. Actually, only a couple of minutes to go. Time went flying. So, I know I just need to add something to it, because there is a duty for local authorities to report any victims of modern slavery to the Home Office. And the Home Office, what it does is basically they provide them accommodation, and they also provide them a leave to remain if they're not from this country. So I think we pretty much covered everything in terms of modern slavery, but it is a widespread area, so it would know, 1 hour is not enough to go into details of this. So do you have any recent examples of any modern slavery cases to add?
Personal cases?
Okay.
I have been dealing with a hard-working businessman who is of Albanian origin, and he has fallen foul of the civil legislation that exists, and this is an important area because it's possible for the police and for the courts to impose sanctions on those who are convicted of a criminal offence, but also those that they believe may pose a future risk of being involved in trafficking, and that is quite onerous, and that puts a big strain on the businesses. So I've been dealing with a number of those cases, and I've dealt with other cases involving those in the traveller community where it's been alleged that people have been using their employees effectively as slaves, although that did not result in prosecution because I think the allegations are quite spurious in that allegation.
Yeah, so we are on the last minute of the show. I know Thomas recently been dealing with some cases. Do you have anything to add for last 30 seconds, Thomas?
No, other than just thank you, Shakil, and to thank Liam. It's been a very informative show, and in fact, I think that we'll have a lot more to talk about on this topic as the years unfold, because I think we'll see a lot more impact of this sensible piece of legislation.
Okay, thank you very much for coming online. We are right towards the end of the show. Thank you very much for listening to our show. It will still be available on podcast and our Inspire FM website. If you want to listen to repeat the telecast, you can go to Inspire FM Facebook page or their website. We are just ending the show now. Thank you very much for listening to us. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. We stream our daily broadcast on inspirefm.org. You'll find all our daily updates on our social media at Inspire FM Luton.